Hello, everybody. This is Casey Swegman from the Tahirih Justice Center, and I'm here with my colleague, Jalitz Villegas. We want to thank everyone for joining us today for our webinar, Supporting Survivors and Individuals at Risk of Forced Marriage, Guidance for Refugee Service Providers. We're going to talk about how to support individuals at risk at the same time as balancing mandates, especially for those of you who are in the refugee resettlement field as caseworkers and other staff, as we realize that can be a really challenging place to be. And so before we dive in, I just want to do a few housekeeping announcements. First and foremost, we have realized that with GoToWebinar, if you are set on full screen under Zoom, you are probably going to notice that some of the PowerPoint slides are cut off. If you go to the Zoom button and select Fit to Screen or 75%, that should solve that problem for you. We really do not recommend using actual size, as we've realized that does cut off the slides quite a bit. I also want to direct people to their control panel on the right-hand side of GoToWebinar that should have a drop-down for questions. We prefer to keep comments and questions in the questions box because it's easier to navigate for us than the chat box. So if you have questions or comments as we go along, we encourage you to put them there. And if we know we're going to get to a question, we will probably just carry on. But if there's something that we would like to engage in the moment, we really do encourage this to be as interactive as possible. And we will try our very best to leave time at the end for an open Q&A. And so before we dive into our content, we're just going to launch our first poll. And we're going to do the same poll at the very end, and we will just give people maybe 1 or 2 more seconds to respond to this, and we'll be doing the same poll at the end and see if there's any change. So I can see the responses are coming in. Jalitz, I don't know if you can see them too as an organizer, but right now it's landing at around 36 to 35% of folks think yes, they may currently be working with or have previously served someone at risk or in a forced marriage. 42% of people are saying no, and 23%, so about a quarter of folks, are unsure. So that is really helpful for us to know as we go along. And I think that unsure is the place where we really hope that this presentation will address, so that folks can feel more confident in their ability to screen for these kinds of cases, to identify them, and feel confident in their intervention. So I'm going to close the poll now and get us back into the slideshow and just give a brief overview of the Tahirih Justice Center so that folks know who we are and where we're coming from. So the Tahirih Justice Center is a national nonprofit. We have 5 offices across the United States in Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, Atlanta, Georgia, San Francisco, California, and Houston, Texas. And really, historically, for the past 20 plus years, the Tahirih Justice Center has been engaged in pro bono immigration legal assistance for survivors of gender-based violence, as well as policy advocacy on the state and federal level to protect asylum laws, to defend against rollbacks, and to expand protections for immigrant survivors of gender-based violence through VAWA and IMBRA and other forms of policy advocacy. And about almost 10 years ago now, the Tahirih Justice Center founded the Forced Marriage Initiative, which is the project on which me and Jalitz work. And that provides direct services, case management, emotional support, technical assistance, relocation counseling, safety planning, you name it, to U.S. survivors and individuals at risk of forced marriage. And we want people to walk away from this presentation not only with an increased personal knowledge and expertise, but also with an understanding that you can always come to the Tahirih Justice Center, reach out to me and Jalitz for support on cases, to help triage, or for a full referral. We really are a one-stop shop for direct services if you feel that is needed. And now I'm going to hand it over to Jalitz to dive into the topic at hand.
Thank you so much, Casey. Hi, everyone. My name is Halitz Villegas, and I work at the Tahirih Justice Center with the FMI, the Forced Marriage Initiative, really as the advocate case manager providing direct client services. And I work with folks all around the nation, providing technical assistance and really helping those service seekers in whatever way that they may need. And so the slide that you see on your screen is the definition that grounds us in the work that we do. This is a very widely used definition, but it is not universally accepted. So just so that we are all on the same page, Tahirih's working definition is: a forced marriage is where one or both people do not or cannot consent to the marriage and typically involves elements of force, fraud, or coercion. We do not equate forced marriage with arranged marriage in every instance. Arranged marriage is a process in which families may take the lead, but the ultimate choice to marry remains with the individual. And choice here is not just about the individual, but also considering the timing or even the idea of getting married at all. So it should be a yes, I want to get married. Yes, I want to get married to this person. And yes, I want to get married at this time. And we see cases from time to time where the client tells us, you know, I did say yes, I wanted my parents involved in the process. I didn't mind the idea of an arranged marriage, but they promised me that I could wait until I finished college. But I'm still in high school. And no matter what I say or what I do, they aren't stopping, they're not listening. And that is when we see things shifting to a forced marriage situation, which can be really scary if you had some control at some point, but now things are moving forward totally out of your control. So this next graphic provided to us by Vidya Sri, a survivor who was at Harvard at the time she created this continuum, and the Rakshan Raja, who worked at the Urban Institute at the time, gives a better idea as to how this change can occur. But please keep in mind that these changes do not always occur in this linear way. It is not a perfect image, but we hope it helps capture the idea that a person can begin in what they feel is an arranged marriage process, but over time find their ability to express preferences or to reject potential suitors they do not think are a good fit, dismiss, or being told they are quote unquote too difficult, they're getting a bad reputation. And sometimes this could mean being threatened with the idea of not being able to marry at all, being told that they are ruining their siblings' marriage prospects by being too picky, or faced with a marriage process going forward without their consent because the time has come and they have no choice and their parents just know what is best for them. So again, it is at the point where the family is dismissing the individual's wishes to not marry the person they have chosen, or to not marry altogether, or the desire to wait until they're done with school or enroll in college, that the process has progressed to a force as consent is being dismissed. And if you have any questions, please feel free to add them in the questions spot. So, one of the first questions we usually get is, does forced marriage really happen in the United States? And the quick answer is yes. Forced marriage is a global problem, and the United States is not an exception. In 2011, Tahirih conducted a survey on forced marriage in immigrant communities in the United States, which received over 500 responses from 47 states. The survey found as many as 3,000 known or suspected cases of forced marriage in the US over a period of just 2 years. And about 2/3 of respondents stated they felt that there were hidden cases in their communities that just weren't coming to the attention of service providers, indicating to us that this number really is much, much larger. So a few findings from the survey, which may further challenge the ideas we may have about what a victim of forced marriage looks like. The survey found that forced marriage affects families of many diverse backgrounds and faiths, and service providers identified survivors from at least 56 different countries of origin. The religious backgrounds of survivors was also incredibly diverse. It included those from Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, and other backgrounds as well as no religious affiliation whatsoever. So religion was not a motivator. Forced marriage impacts people of all age groups. And in our work at Tahirih, we have served clients as young as 12 years old and those over the age of 50. The marriages can happen in the United States and abroad, and those threatened with travel face increased risk of isolation from help and lack of rights and protections. And we'll talk a little bit more about imminent travel abroad towards the end of the presentation. Important to note, the individuals at risk that we work with in the Forced Marriage Initiative include U.S. citizens, legal permanent residents, and it also includes individuals who were born in the U.S., maybe even their parents were born in the U.S., so thinking multi-generational immigrant households, as well as survivors with no immigrant tie whatsoever. So the dynamics in refugee communities can be very blurry for those involved. It can be a blurry situation for the individual facing harm, the service provider, and even community members. It is really common for service providers to not ask questions regarding how marriages came to be, particularly if you're working with someone who is sharing details about their marriage, but not indicating that it was forced or that they're facing some kind of abuse. Many who work with refugees are worried about being seen as culturally competent and don't want to do something disrespectful. And I think that's a wonderful desire to want to understand others' cultures and backgrounds. But in doing so, we must really check our own biases. Are we asking this particular family the same questions we may ask another service seeker? Has anyone asked you to connect them to resources or to explain their rights? As refugee providers, you may be working with the entire family, and understandably so, can develop deep feelings for the family unit. It is incredibly important to always remember that individuals, regardless of their age, their background, they have a right to safety. They have a right to reject parts of their familial customs they do not agree with, or that they may feel it's harmful to them, and they truly have a right to shape their life in whatever way works best for them, even if that means not going along with what family has planned or wants for them. A big red flag that I want to highlight here, or that should alert you to asking more questions, if you're working with someone who suddenly is engaged or goes on a trip and comes back married or even pregnant. I hope you ask some deeper questions, and we'll talk about that ahead. In regards to mental health, I encourage you to check your assumption as to why a person might be depressed or healing from an injury. We can assume this is part of the resettlement process, that they were hurt while in a refugee camp, that they are just quote unquote adjusting, but they very well could be in an abusive home and living with someone they never wanted to be in the first place, who likely has most of the control. Casey, would you like to add anything here about your experiences working with refugees?
Yes, thank you, Khalitz. I really appreciate that. I think, full disclosure, I worked with the International Rescue Committee in the Baltimore office as a special needs care coordinator in my previous life. And we worked with so many women who came to us with notes in their case files or recommendations from case managers who said, you know, she really needs mental health intervention. She's got PTSD, she has anxiety, she has major depression. And most of us, including myself, assumed it was the trauma of war or displacement or the refugee camp or resettlement that was causing the trauma, that was causing the anxiety, that was causing the depression. And I started to see a pattern of women really disengaging with mental health services because they didn't see them as helpful. And then over time, what I realized later was that many were then coming to disclose only once things got so bad and so dangerous in the home that they really didn't know what else to do, that most of those symptoms that people were making a lot of assumptions about were coming from a place of feeling very, very oppressed and feeling traumatized in their relationship, in their own home. Some had disclosed eventually that they arrived to the United States married, but that marriage was entered into against their will and without their consent prior to resettlement. Many disclosed that there was active abuse in the home and that no one was asking them those questions. Everyone wanted to focus on their quote unquote refugee experience, but we're really missing the mark. And so I just want to make sure that this issue, domestic violence, gender-based violence, and forced marriage, is on people's radar so that we are checking our assumptions and asking the right questions.
Thank you so much, Casey. It's a great segue into our next section, which is really talking about how forced marriage intersects with other forms of abuse. We're talking about this issue because forced marriage is a form of violence against women in its own right. When a woman feels she has no real choice when it comes to a marriage, she loses a great deal of power and control over her own life. More often than not, forced marriage is just one part of the spectrum of other harms that a woman who is forced to marry may face in her lifetime. Likely, a woman forced to marry experienced abuse and violence prior to the marriage as part of the efforts to get her to submit to a marriage she did not want, or to get her to a place where the consequences for saying no were too severe. Many of our clients have been told that they are ruining their family's reputation, they are causing them shame, that their father or one of their parents has a bad heart and this is killing them. They will be disowned and kicked out, amongst many other threats. Then we have the marriage itself, which in these cases is an act of violence and abuse. And while not all women forced into marriage experience violence from their partner, they are entering a relationship that by its very nature implies a tremendous power imbalance. And tragically, more often than not, a woman forced into marriage will experience abuse from her spouse. On this slide, you see the most common forms of abuse that forced marriage intersects with. And I'll speak briefly on some of these, and we'll cover more a little bit deeper in the presentation. So when it comes to child abuse, a substantial number of forced marriage victims are minors. A child or teenager being forced into marriage by her family may be subjected to multiple coercive tactics that, taken together, could amount to child abuse. In the case of a minor, the harms that follow a forced marriage also amount to child abuse. Human trafficking. Even though forced sex within a forced marriage is not a commercial sex act as defined by federal trafficking laws, arguably, human trafficking can describe some forced marriage cases. Some forced marriages may also have elements of human trafficking if the driving motivation for the family is financial, to settle a debt or obtain a bride price. But not all, and labeling a family as traffickers can have very deep repercussions for the service seeker and her community. Elements of forced labor may also be present, and particularly in cases of servile marriage. I'm going to skip discussing stalking and domestic violence, but we certainly can answer questions if that comes up. I think those are pretty clear. When it comes to female genital mutilation and cutting, this can be a precursor to marriage or a warning sign that a forced marriage may take place. It can be a factor in family and community decisions regarding who is an acceptable marriage partner and may trigger the risk of FGMC. The survivor may face ongoing pressure and abuse around FGMC throughout the course of marriage and childbirth. So it's not something that only happens once. It could happen more than once. When it comes to rape and sexual assault, non-consensual sexual conduct and behavior likely will follow a non-consensual marriage. Advocates and researchers have also found that sexual assault and rape can not only be a consequence of a forced marriage, but also can be the cause of a forced marriage. So for example, a family marrying their daughter off because she was raped or assaulted, and they don't want others to know that she is no longer a virgin. And And many times that could be marrying her off even to the rapist if that person is known to the family. That's just an example. Yeah. And to finalize this section on the intersections of forced marriage with other forms of abuse, I'll read this quote which highlights the importance of asking questions and digging a little bit deeper, digging beyond the surface of what you may be used to. Advocates speak to many women who are facing domestic violence, abuse, and/or sexual assault in their marriage. Only later in these conversations does it emerge that the conditions upon which they may have been married were under duress, pressure, and ultimately against their will.
Thank you, Halitz. We actually had an interesting question come up, and I want to take a pause to answer it. From Rima, who's asking, who are you suggesting ask these questions before they are relocated to the US? Base the decision whether to relocate them on whether it was a forced marriage. Would we allow the victim to relocate but not the abuser? How can we address these harmful practices against women and girls among refugees? And I think that's an amazing question. Today, we are focusing entirely on folks who are working domestically in refugee resettlement. And Halitz is going to talk specifically about how to ask questions and when, and how to actually phrase them. And so we are talking specifically to those working with folks who have already been resettled in the US. That said, there is a lot of discussion in the advocacy community about the way in which PAs, principal applicants, are selected and how that can be used as a tool of power and control. If resettlement depends upon the success or failure, quote unquote, of the principal applicant's refugee narrative, and then all of the benefits and all of the services stem from that person who always tends to be the male head of household, then we have a power imbalance already right there with the way that the principal applicant process works and the way that benefits flow from that. And so while that is a beast to be addressed in a different space, I did want to acknowledge that that is an important, those are important questions to be asking. What is happening prior to resettlement that can then double down on the challenges that refugee women in particular face when it comes to getting out of abusive relationships. So thank you for that question. And Halitz, I will advance your slide now.
Oh, thank you so much, Casey. So now I want to take a moment to share a case scenario with you all to provide some solid grounding in what the cases that we're working with look like and how they may manifest with those who you are working with. I'm going to share with you the story of Sonia, and I want you to keep her in mind. If you can, take some notes, maybe what stands out to you, because we will be coming back to Sonia's story towards the end of the presentation. So Sonia is 18 years old and a US citizen. Her parents exercise a great deal of control over her and her siblings' lives, forbidding dating and requiring she come straight home when school lets out. Sonia also has a part-time job at a local store, but she must give her parents her work schedule every week and make sure she is home within a half hour of her shift ending. Her parents also monitor her and her siblings' computer and cell phone use very closely. Sonia's parents have always told her that they would arrange her marriage, and recently they informed her that they found a good match and want to travel to their home country over winter break for the wedding. Sonia has told her parents she is not ready to get married, but her family insists that the marriage must go forward now. Her parents have told her that if she does not marry the man of their choosing, she will bring shame to the family and that her refusal to get married is killing them and ruining her younger sister's marriage prospects. In the past, Sonia has witnessed an older sister being beaten by their parents after she fled from her abusive husband and tried to return to the family home. Her sister was also resistant to the marriage their parents had arranged for her, but ended up giving in to family pressure. Sonia does not want to end up in the same situation, but does not know how to safely resist the pressure to get married. Sonia's parents have bought plane tickets for June, stating that the whole family will be going abroad to visit their relatives, particularly a sick grandmother. Sonia is suspicious that a wedding may be waiting for her overseas, but knows that if she refuses to go or tries to leave, it could lead to escalating abuse and potentially violence in the home. So I'm wondering, now that you've heard that case scenario, if this sounds similar to perhaps something that has been shared by someone you work with in the past. I'm wondering if you're maybe thinking about how your organization or agency could work with Sonia, if possible, or if not, why not? And if you could add that in the chat, that would be great. We'll just take a couple of minutes to see those responses.
Yeah, thank you, Halitz, for sharing the case scenario. And I think this is the perfect time for those who have already been commenting about the blurriness between arranged and forced marriage to hear from you about how you might respond to a case like this, how you may have responded in the past, and what challenges you see in responding appropriately. We have someone who's commented, I've heard this all too many times. People might be in the chat instead of the questions, but we would love to see people respond if you have reflections on this case scenario.
Well, I'll just highlight some of the strengths that I see. It's the fact that she is an adult and not a minor. It's really helpful. We'll talk a bit more about how minors face, some greater risk and difficulties in working with them. So that is helpful in that if she does need to perhaps seek safe shelter, that would be an asset. She has an idea of what would happen, even though she may not have evidence. She has witnessed someone in the past, so that should alert us of really listening and having a better understanding of what the family could do to her, as she has seen what they have done to her sister. She also has a job, and even though she has to give her parents the schedule, that could be a great place to perhaps have a safe conversation. Perhaps she has a good relationship with the manager and could call for help then, could meet with an advocate during work times.
Yeah,
those are some of the things I see.
And we have a couple more comments. Sheila's saying she is probably afraid of being discarded by the family, so a lot of women just endure the marriage. And another participant saying that they hear this kind of scenario frequently.
So I thank you so much for sharing. I definitely think that, speaking with Sonia, getting a bit more of an understanding of what she would want, right? What has been helpful when the parents have discussed, marriage in the past, if anything, and from there going into discussions of what are resources available in the community, or maybe not in the community, depending on what she's looking for, because she likely does not know what support is out there.
Yeah, and we will be breaking down all of the different ways in which making decisions in this kind of family context is very difficult, and figuring out what you want to do and getting the right kind of support can be really challenging. And we'll be talking a lot more about how to provide that support and what it looks like to work with someone, to work alongside someone when they are facing this kind of threat and need to make some really big decisions.
And I think one of the questions stated how we can help in such a scenario. This is, I would say the classic scenario of those who we work with. We're working with service seekers facing this exact type of harm, where we are, identifying when and how we can speak. At times that may mean providing a safe cell phone to the client, to the woman or girl, so that she is able to speak with us and other advocates confidentially and have that for safety. That's also informing her of her rights and options, educating on what resources are there in the community. At times, many of the clients don't know about youth organizations, shelters, or domestic violence shelters. This does not mean that we are pushing for her to leave or anything like that, but informing of what is actually out there and possible. And also then having discussions of what help is available if she were to travel, and being really honest with the limited help because in many countries it can be very difficult for someone to be repatriated back, and we'll talk a bit more. But those are just some of the ways that we could assist. Then it may mean a crisis response. If the person's like, no, I need help, you need to get me out of here, then we are working with them and other partners, other organizations to get that person to a safe place, and ultimately to a place where they feel safe. Perhaps they enroll in school, they're working, have an apartment. So it really depends on where the person is at, and it's really long-term case management. We're working with folks for not just weeks and months, we're working with them for many, many years.
Yeah, and I think we just have a few more important comments, and then maybe we'll move on so we can get to the heart of that response guidance later in the presentation. But Julia shared that it would benefit to have earlier involvement and possibly a stronger presence of support services in middle and high schools. And I think that is a really, really good point. And there was a question, how can organizations such as Tahirih help? I think Halit's really just outlined that. It's long-term intensive case management, no matter where someone is residing in the United States. And we had another comment, it's very complicated as an immigrant woman for me. However, because Sonia's 18, that for me will be helpful because we can connect her to resources she's able to make decisions. And I think that's a really key point too. And we'll talk a bit about the challenges that we face as service providers when working with someone who is a minor in a state where the laws are maybe not working on their side, and not caught up to these kinds of dynamics. We have a recommendation of a victim protection program, and we're definitely encouraging folks to build relationships with your local victim services programs. At the IRC, it was really important to us to build a strong relationship with House of Ruth, which is one of the most primary domestic violence shelter services in the state of Maryland, and to make sure that they had presentations about who our clients were. They had cultural humility training, and we emphasized the necessity of having language access. And building that relationship is key, because the goal of this presentation today is not to make you a domestic violence expert or service provider or a hotline advocate. It is to make sure that you have basic skills and awareness, and to encourage you to build relationships with the local victim services community so that you have strong referral relationships when these types of cases come up.
Definitely. And also that Tahirih is here. The Forced Marriage Initiative is housed in the Virginia area, but our clients are all over the nation. And at times they are abroad as well, needing assistance in returning to the U.S. So we are also a resource that you can utilize in contacting us directly for that technical assistance, but also as folks who you can refer those clients to, particularly if you're working with the entire family and you need someone to essentially handle the harm that is happening while you keep separate and do the work that you're doing with the entire family.
Yeah. And the last question we have is, do we serve males who do not want to participate in a forced marriage? And yes, our program does serve men and boys, those who are gender nonconforming, everyone on the spectrum. And there are somewhat different dynamics when working with men and boys who are facing the threat of a forced marriage. But just to answer that question quickly, our program is open to those individuals who need services, and we understand those dynamics can be a bit unique, but are well prepared to serve them. And we could do a whole separate presentation on what those dynamics look like, and how when the young man or a boy comes forward about a forced marriage, there is often a young woman or girl on the other side of it who also needs services. So to just be aware of those dynamics. But I think
thank you so much.
In the interest of time, we should just dive into this slide.
For sure, and I'm also going to talk about that on the next slide, so thank you. So a common question we get is, why would anyone force someone into a marriage? And the truth is that that's a very complex question. So what we have tried to do with this slide is illustrate how community level and societal level factors, looking at that larger circle, that are present across cultures and communities are just some of the root causes for why forced marriage exists as a tool of power, a tool of control, oppression. And then we relate those to the magnifying glass, which are the root causes for individual and family level triggers that can be the case-specific motivation for a forced marriage. So we heard an example regarding Sonia. Here's another common one. Let's say you come from a community with strong feelings towards control of female sexuality. You are rumored to be dating a boy from school. Maybe your brother saw you talking to a boy at the library, and he tells your family. Your specific family opposes girls having contact with the opposite sex and engaging in sexual activity. So even the perception that you are engaging in sexual activity may be enough for your family to decide that you getting married is in your best interest and in the best interest of the family, to avoid you getting an undesirable reputation and to avoid perhaps your marriageability prospects in the future.
So I'm just going to jump in here because we've had a question in the chat that prompted me to want to reiterate that. The question was, do these families have contempt for women? And my answer would be to go back to what Halitz was sharing about these root causes. These communal and societal root causes exist across communities in the United States. We are focusing specifically on refugees today, but I challenge you to find any society in the US or elsewhere that doesn't have an issue with patriarchal values or gender inequality and control over female sexuality. That is a homegrown American problem as much as it is a refugee and immigrant problem. So I wouldn't say that any particular community or family has a specific contempt for women, but that it tends to be more complicated than that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Casey. So victims face a broad range of tactics. Those threats can be towards them, towards their siblings, their parents, loved ones, and the list goes on and on. They are hesitant about seeking help and taking action. There's emotional blackmail, as you've heard from some of the examples I've given, economic threats. And, I have clients that range in the spectrum of socioeconomic status, so threats of maybe finances, being cut off, not being able to enroll in college or continue their studies, etc. There's, again, threats of violence, not just to them, but others. At times, parents can be very manipulative and hurting themselves, or perhaps threaten that if the client we're working with does not go through with this marriage, and the burden will be passed down to to another sibling. There's fear of consequences, to self, to family. There's lack of knowledge about the laws and resources in the U.S. that could be resources that could be a protection. The cases definitely are more complicated when they involve minors. And regarding our, the gendered language we have used, we've used gendered language because most of the male clients we work with aren't facing the physical or sexual harms that the women and girls we work with are. Typically for the men we serve, they are facing more economic abuse, they're facing fear of being cut off, or perhaps facing that being married to someone of the opposite gender to reinforce heteronormative values. But that's just a little bit to answer the previous question. And Casey, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Halitz. And I think I would also say that, we do use a lot of feminine pronouns in these types of presentations, and it's not to diminish the experience of others, but statistically, women and girls are the most impacted by these forms of gender-based violence, and that is why we do use those feminine pronouns. And so in the interest of time, I might move a little quickly through this piece so we get to that bread and butter of the how to intervene that is at the end of this presentation. But I want to talk briefly about child marriage in the United States from the perspective of the Tahirih Justice Center. Again, we always want to be honest about the fact that just because this is how we train and this is our opinion, it doesn't mean it's the universal opinion, and we encourage everyone to think critically. But to begin with, we as an organization do not equate child marriage with forced marriage in every instance. And we have had some very robust conversations with advocates for youth and others who are working very, very hard to empower older teens, 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds in particular, to have more rights and more autonomy and more ability to consent, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's with financial assistance, or in other spaces where right now minors in this country are really very legally disabled in many, many arenas of their life. And I can see and have heard from 2 highly mature 17-year-olds who are both fully and freely consenting to a marriage. And as we do not go in to communities or to families who are practicing arranged marriage and would not consider their situation forced and wave our fingers around and label them as forced marriage survivors, as that's not what they feel for themselves. That is the same approach we take to child marriage in some instances. I can see a world in which two consenting minors do marry. That said, the majority of child marriage in the United States appear to involve some very concerning factors. The majority of cases in the data involve girls marrying adult men. Some of those adults were decades older than those young girls, and that pregnancy exceptions are in contradiction to statutory rape laws and laws on the assault of a minor, which gives us sort of an ethical and moral mismatch around what is allowed, what is acceptable conduct, what is criminal conduct in one space, and what is acceptable and validated by a marriage license in another. And of course, when we're talking about forced marriage, we see huge concerns with parental consent exceptions. In the state of Maryland, for example, where I used to work at the IRC, minors as young as 15 can get married with the consent of just one parent. And what we've seen is that when that piece of paper is signed, no one at the courthouse even asks the minor a question. And even if there is a second parent who is trying to be protective, their signature isn't even required. And so if you have one perpetrating parent, it is their signature alone that can stand in the place of the consent of that minor and any protective individuals that might be around that person. And so that is why there has been such a campaign to end child marriage in the United States through legislative advocacy. And there has been a lot of progress. The Tahirih Justice Center started the movement in Virginia in 2016. The first law was passed to address child marriage in the United States. And since then, many states have taken up legislative campaigns. New organizations and survivors are coming forward every single day to address this problem in the states where they are. And just some basic statistics, between the year 2000 and 2015, there were over 200,000 minors married in America, and the highest absolute numbers included Texas, Florida, Kentucky, Alabama, Tennessee, Arkansas, Virginia, Illinois, and Missouri. Important to note that of those states, when that stat first came out, Texas, Florida, Kentucky, Virginia, and possibly others on that list, but I know for sure those because we were deeply involved, have updated their laws. And so if they can do it, so can every other state, right? A lot of people try and malign places, particularly in the South, for being behind. But as a Maryland native, we are the ones, quite frankly, who are the most behind. And so we all have to really clean up what's in our own backyards. Challenges for minors facing the threat of forced marriage, I think, given what Halitz has already shared, much of this is already fairly obvious. A huge lack of knowledge of their rights in the United States, and the fact that those rights are, in fact, incredibly limited because of the way our Constitution is written. Children are basically property of their parents until they turn 18. Oftentimes, if they are seeking to get assistance through the court system, they have a lack of evidence. Sometimes the only evidence someone has of the threat of a forced marriage is, I just know. It happened to my sister, it happened to my mother, it happened to other girls in my community. I just know it's going to happen. Can I give you a wedding invitation? Do I have a recorded conversation? Do I have a threatening text message? No, but I just know it's going to happen. Doesn't really hold up in court, unfortunately. Lack of capacity and standing to initiate court action on their own. We often need to partner with really sophisticated pro bono family law attorneys to get work done on these cases if someone does want to engage with the system. Law enforcement truly defers to the rights of parents, so oftentimes if someone does run away to seek help and they are a minor, parents will simply report them missing. They will present as very bereaved and worried about their child, and they will engage with law enforcement to force that child to return home as a delinquent. And even if the individual does say that they are facing forced marriage, they are often not believed. CPS is often ill-prepared to work on these cases in a way that is helpful, or they see it as entirely outside of their mandate. And for minors in particular, there are extreme risks of repercussions if they are unsuccessful. And in particular, an example that always comes to my mind is that a well-meaning school counselor did call CPS when a student of theirs revealed that they were facing the threat of a forced marriage overseas over spring break. And that CPS caseworker, with all good intentions, went to the home that day. Nobody told the minor that that's what was going to happen. They confronted the parents. The parents denied the situation. The CPS worker left the home, and the very next day, that young girl was put on a plane to her family's country of origin, and we did not hear from her again. So it is very important to understand the risks and limitations when engaging with systems. Moving on to the legal landscape, and I know we're covering a lot, but it's important to be aware that on the federal level, there is no specific criminal law, and that currently, as it stands, there is no minimum age for a spouse to be brought from overseas. The US citizen sponsor has to be 18, but what we are seeing are large numbers of underage, typically brides, being brought from countries overseas as fiancés and as brides, and sometimes with those vast age differences, again, that are very concerning. We do have a memo on our website that outlines the 9 states and 2 jurisdictions that on the state level have forced marriage specific criminal offenses. The list is there if you want to know what's actually in that statute. You can go to our website and find the memo there. We have never had a client who has wanted to take a criminal charge forward against their own parents. What they want is for the marriage to stop. The knowledge that there is a criminal code related to forced marriage can help them in their debates and their negotiations. It's another tool in their toolkit for some families to be able to say, this is against the law. You're breaking the law in the US. Sometimes that's enough to get parents to pump the brakes and to slow down and to listen. Sometimes it's not, but it's important to give everyone the information that can help them, and how they choose to use it is up to them. And we already talked about CPS mandates. And again, there is commonly a misfit between what can qualify for a protection order, the relationship, the conduct, etc. And many of forced marriage situations just do not fit into those mandates as they are written currently in the United States. And that's another space for policy advocacy. Very, very briefly at a glance, this is the progress that's been made. Someone already noted, they're very up to date, that 4 states have passed laws, minimum age 18, no exceptions, and the rest are making very good progress, but not that bright line, and some have made no progress at all. Maryland has failed 5 sessions in a row to pass a law. I know I'm drilling down on Maryland a lot, but it's where I'm from, very passionate about it. So if you want more information on this, there's an entire webpage, tons of reports and resources devoted to this on our website, which is there on the slide. And so apologies for going so fast, but passing it back to Halitz now.
Thank you so much, Casey. I know that we covered a lot of information, a lot of material, and I think the next few pieces are really important. We can move on to the next slide regarding warning signs. Yeah, so very, very, very important for me to call out for you to watch your bias. One red flag alone, one warning sign alone may not be indicative of a forced marriage threat. However, if several are present, we encourage you to ask the right questions. Okay, so big red flags that we have seen in the cases we work with is a history of family history, of forced or early marriages. If there's been mentions of honor violence or disputes, really just disputes being resolved with some sort of violence is something to ask a bit more about. Suicide attempts, but also self-harming of a parent to manipulate the girl to comply. We hear that a lot. Parents can be very manipulative, so they may not hurt the girl, the woman themselves, but they may hurt their own person, right? Ripping their shirt, screaming, yelling, hitting themselves. Which can be very, very scary, very, very manipulative. In 2015, a report by the World Health Organization noted that suicide was found to be the leading cause of death for older adolescent girls worldwide, and forced marriage specifically was identified as a factor that increased the risk. The death of a parent, I think, is one that may be a bit odd, but we've seen that, with some families, a parent's role or their ultimate dream maybe to see their children be married off, their ultimate responsibility, and if they are sick or one of them has died, we could see that be the the impetus for marriage to occur. With health issues, unwanted or concealed pregnancy is a big one. we could have a lot of assumption as to why that may be the case, but the girl may know that for her family, she will be forced to marry, the child's father, even if that person was someone who sexually abused her, or just to marry someone altogether. So that's really important. Moving on to the next slide, which gives more warning signs. When it comes to law enforcement, a lot of my younger clients have a history of running away, and even adult clients being reported as missing to police when they have fled to safe shelter or when they have relocated perhaps to another state for safety. The families can make the victim appear like a delinquent youth or someone struggling with mental health. So when law enforcement is called, they know the victim and they know that they are just, a troublemaker. With education, sudden changes in grades, persistent absences, from work or school, fear of upcoming holidays, and that one may go back to Sonia, right? The family mentioning, oh, we're going to go, during, I believe it said winter break, maybe summer break, right? So a lot of my clients are worried around that time. So this may be someone who is unsure if they'll return to work or will return to school after the break. So hopefully at this point, you're wondering how you could ask someone if they're facing a forced marriage. And we can move on to the next slide, Casey. Everyone has a role to play, and I just hope that you don't assume, we can move to the next one, that's good, thank you. That you don't assume that someone else will catch the problem. So to be clear, we're not asking anyone to go outside of your professional boundaries, your expertise or comfort. In fact, it is safer for individuals at risk that you do not try and take situations into your own hands and instead have clear boundaries about what you can and can't do, but do use your best judgment and be mindful of your assumptions, and please provide resources. We are here to help. You can give our email to the service seeker. You can give our number. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. Yeah. Here are some tips, to help you ask, the questions, the tough questions. If you don't have a relationship with a person, you notice some red flags, you may need to do some small talk, build a little rapport before going straight to asking about the questions. And remember to ask in a safe space and not in front of others. So here's just some tips, right? Depending on how you're working with this person, you may know a little bit more about them that could lead you to opening the door. And on the next slide, you will see some more of the straightforward questions. Like if you know, or the issue of a forced marriage or the issue of marriage has come up, and they're hesitant, something related to marriage is coming up, you may be able to ask more straightforward questions. And asking is key, and not just by saying, are you being forced into marriage? Likely the answer is going to be no. For many individuals, talking about these things is a personal, it's private family matter. It's very difficult, and they may feel like they're breaking trust with their families, and they're worried about how you will perceive them, how you will perceive their community, their culture. So they could be really scared of consequences. So thinking again of how you ask the questions, how you introduce them is key. Moving on to a little bit more about working with minors and asking these questions. Those of you who work with minors really hold the key to connecting them to resources. And I know we all have our mandates, and again, we are not asking you to go against them, but we are asking for you to share our email, our phone number, just like you would a teen helpline or other type of hotline. We are here to work with them as well. If they're disclosing forced marriage, what is the perception of the risk? If they say that they can't say no, what will happen? What makes them worried? And again, remember to have these conversations in a safe space, not in front of family and even in front of siblings, to really have this conversation again in a space where they feel that they can actually talk to you, and know that we are here to provide assistance. We're here to help and coordinate support as needed. So before you ask, root yourself in non-judgmental point of view. Be knowledgeable about resources. Be ready to make referrals, even if it's just providing our contact information. Give them some support, as this may be the only chance they will have to call or speak to someone about this. Be ready for those second thoughts and backtracking on decisions, because it is a very, very scary time. The perpetrators have probably demonstrated in the home that Other family members are vulnerable to abuse and retaliation. So it really does take a continuum of support and coordination of resources and services. Very important to assure the service seeker, regardless of age, that they have a right to say no to a marriage they do not want. That may be the first time they've ever heard that. Our perspective is that no religion sanctions forced marriage. This type of reassurance is often critical, as clients may be going through a crisis of feeling like they're breaking with their family, their culture, and religion by resisting a marriage. And many times when that is the case, us at Tahirih will connect folks with the appropriate religious leader, whether that's a priest, imam, whatever it may be, who is a safe contact that is able to speak with them a little bit deeper if religion is something that is coming up, just like we would any other survivor of domestic violence who's needing to connect with resources. If you were working with someone, in a domestic violence shelter and, that person returns to their abuser, you wouldn't say that they couldn't come back to help, right? So this is the same case here. Be ready for second thoughts and for them to backtrack, and that's okay.
And Halitza, I'm just going to chime in here one last time to reiterate on just how long-term support tends to need to be in these cases, and to recognize that some refugee resettlement staff are funded for 90 days or 8 months or a very short period of time to be working with someone. And what we want to make sure is that you set them up with a service provider that can be with them for the long term. And if that can't be you, then recognizing that and being honest about that and getting them connected to that service provider, whether it's us or someone local that can work alongside them for that extended period of time, is going to be critical. Because if you start to be the one who intervenes and then all of a sudden you're told that that case is no longer in your caseload, their service period is up, you're not funded to continue, you don't have extended case management, then we're leaving that person in the lurch. And so we really need to be careful about the role we decide to step into and how appropriate that is. And so I just encourage folks again to think about who your referrals are going to be and to make those when that's appropriate.
Yeah, thank you so much, Casey. And just a little bit about imminent travel abroad. We, as stated before, do work client-centered. The decision that the client is making or wants to make is really what the lead that we take. That may mean that the person does go through with the marriage that they don't want because they feel like there's no other way for them to remain close to their family or whatever it may be. It could be that that person who they're marrying is going to help financially and their family is struggling, right? There's many reasons why someone will go will follow through with the marriage that they never wanted, and we can still be of support to that person emotionally, resource-wise, etc. Although we're client-centered, we're also very, very clear and truthful about the harms with travel abroad. And we urge clients to stay in the U.S. if they can, because they are just the help isn't there. And many folks believe that they can just go to the embassy, they can just call, they'll get swept away. Special ops is not coming. That's not how it works. And in some areas, there's no U.S. embassy. In some areas right now, because of COVID, things have changed. Hours are different. Folks can just show up to the embassy, the consular office, etc. So we do urge clients to stay in the U.S. and we do have a wonderful safety tips for traveling abroad on our website, and we'll add that to your packet in the email that we'll send. So I know that we're running a little bit on time, but I do want to go over a little bit more, or have really Casey go over a little bit more on Sonia and some responses. And for those of you who have to leave, we completely understand. If you can stay, I think it will be really, really wonderful. Another maybe 5-10 minutes to go over some responses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've had really robust Q&A throughout, so I'm okay with moving forward with these slides and leaving space for discussion of them at the end. So if you remember Sonia and her story, let's say she comes to you to disclose what's going on, that she thinks she is being threatened with a forced marriage and isn't quite sure what to do. She tells you all the details that we shared earlier. So here's a response that we've been told by people who call us they've gotten from time to time from folks that they've disclosed to. And It looks like this. So Sonia has just left your office. You feel heartbroken about her situation. You tell a coworker that had Sonia been raised in a different culture, she would not have been subject to such a devastating fate. You tell your coworker that there is little you can do since the practice is so culturally ingrained, and that many women, in fact, do not even mind. You tell Sonia to disobey her parent. If you tell Sonia to disobey her parents, it would be culturally insensitive, because this is just how it's done in some cultures. Your coworker nods her head and chimes in, "We don't want to be racist. It's better not to get involved in family matters." So we could spend a whole day on this, and I'm sure lots of folks have reactions. But I think, first and foremost, what we want to acknowledge is that it is well-meaning, but the intent is incredibly wrong. While not being racist is a totally admirable thing, it is racist to assume that every single person in this culture accepts forced marriage as okay. And it is more important to acknowledge that there are many women and men in all cultures standing up to say that gender-based violence is wrong. And a woman coming forward to claim her rights and to say no and to say, I love my family and my community and my culture, but I don't accept this. You have to be able to hold that complexity and not, wash your hands of the situation because, well, that's just how their culture is. Everyone defines culture for themselves. This person, Sonia, is trying to define her culture for herself, and it is our role to support that journey and to connect her to other people who have done the same thing and ended the cycle of violence in their own family. Scenario number 2. Sonia breaks down crying in your office and asks you for your opinion. Fighting back your own tears, you tell her, "You are the same age as my own daughter, and I want the same things for you that she has. You have the right to date anyone you like, get to know them, and explore the relationship emotionally and physically. Marriage, if you choose to even get married, should be your decision and your decision alone. If your parents can't agree with that, then I'm sorry, but it's their loss, not yours." So what we see here is a little bit more support, a little bit more resonance, but again, pretty problematic. It's an improvement upon scenario number 1 in that it's offering some kind of resonance and support, but we see some issues here, particularly around this very westernized, prescriptive sense of how relationships are formed and dating and marriage. Sonia may very well not be ready to be married, but she may still believe that you explore sexual relationships with your partner once you're married. She might still like the way in which dating culture exists within her community. So it's not rejecting all of that by way of rejecting a forced marriage. And things are usually far more complicated than that. And before prescribing or assuming, you want to have a much broader conversation with Sonia, because that's really going to shut her down if she feels like she has to accept what you've just said or go along with the marriage. That again puts her between a rock and a hard place. And this last piece, the basically do your own thing, and if they don't like it, that's their problem, is so dismissive of how painful and how gutting it can be to be estranged from your family. Losing your family's support and your family's love is a deep loss for Sonia, and we have to acknowledge that it is not easy to walk away from your family, no matter what kind of abuse is present. So response number 3. I bet you can tell what's coming, but Sonia tells you that she is considering going on the trip and asks you what she should do. You take a deep breath and you tell her, "Sonia, I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you. It took a lot of strength to open up about all of this today. I, along with our entire team, are here to support you in whatever way you think is best. I want to share some resources with you that may also help and provide information on some of the options you may have. So far, though, what or who has helped you through this or has been a source of support?" And so I think the beauty of this response is pretty obvious. I love the way that it emphasizes again and again that Sonia is in the driver's seat, that you are here to help, but on her terms. and that final question really helps her to start identifying the strengths and the resources that she already has, that she's not alone, and that we can work with her, and that there is hope. I think this response really, in just a few sentences, sends all of those messages that you would want to send to Sonia. And Halitz, I don't know if you have anything to add before we move on.
No, I think that covers it. If anyone wants to add more on the chat or the Q&A, I just think it's really important to, validate what Sonia is going through and really, investigate with kindness what has been helpful, which can really help you, help you as a service provider identify what resources are needed, who to connect with, who, is a safe person to talk to about this, and remembering that, you may be the only one that Sonia is talking to, right? The only one or the first person outside of maybe her immediate family, who she's sharing, these feelings, these thoughts, this complicated situation with, and your response is very critical because you really could, shut the door, for lack of better words, in her feeling trusting of others.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other big takeaway I hope people have is that when someone comes to you with a situation like this, a lot of times our first response can be, oh my God, it's completely on me to solve this for this person. I must rescue. I need to be the hero. And I hope that the biggest takeaway from this presentation today is that that is not only not your responsibility, but it's also not helpful. And I hope that with this information, we have relieved some of the burden of feeling like when someone comes to you and discloses, that is on you to solve. It's not. It is a partnership. It is walking alongside someone, and it is finding the resources that they really need. And so I hope that that is another big takeaway and quite frankly, a relief for folks that can feel overwhelmed by the day-to-day work already, and then feeling like we're ill-equipped and ill-prepared to respond holistically to a situation such as Sonia's, because you're not alone in supporting Sonia, and Sonia has a lot of strengths herself. So I hope that is another major takeaway. And with that, I have gotten some questions in the chat about how do we get in touch with you? How do we refer you? Refer people to you? We'll leave this slide up so people can screenshot it or write down. Again, it's all on our website, and it'll be in the pack that we send out at the end to folks who attended. But yeah, that is Halitz's direct phone number, and you can call it from anywhere in the US for technical assistance or to make a referral. And we check the fmi@tahirih.org email address every single day, and we typically get back to people within 24 hours unless it's a weekend. We do not operate as a hotline, so we are not available over the weekend. But thank you all so much for your time, and for those who stayed on. We are going to do one final poll for those of you who are still with us, and I'm going to launch that right now, and hopefully it will only take a moment, and then we'll let you go. So same question. Do you think you've served someone in the past, or do you think you might have served someone now? All right, responses are still kind of coming in, but I think I'll go ahead and close the poll, and I can share the results. So we did see a small decrease in the folks who said they were unsure. I'm glad to see that. And a little bit of difference in the more folks saying that yes, they think they have served someone, and around the same amount of folks that are saying no. So hoping that with the red flags and the warning signs and the dynamics that we talked about today, that this issue is more on your radar, and that we can always be of assistance to you, and you know that you can refer clients to us and reach out to us for thought partnership on these cases.
Yeah, and if anyone is interested in receiving our newsletter, getting more information about the work that we are doing, that the survivors who we may be working with are doing, and learning about trainings, please go to our website. It's that Prevent Forced Marriage on that last slide, and you'll see the tab on the top right corner to join receive our newsletter. And please feel free to email. I know we answered a lot of questions. We went really far, but if there's some specific things you're wondering about, regardless of what it may be, please know that we're here and we're happy to speak with you individually if you want additional support, whether that's for you as a service provider, or maybe as someone who's working with a family, or if you're wanting to refer someone, we're here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.